Chapter 4. Listen. Don't just do something. Stand there. Sometimes the best way to communicate is to say nothing at all. When most people think about communication, they focus on speaking. But if we're going to be effective in the moment, we also have to listen, paying close attention to our audience's mental and emotional state and using the information we gain to inform what we say. Fred Dust, author of the book Making Conversation and former senior partner and global managing director for the design firm IDEO, has seen the power of listening firsthand. In 2010, he had the privilege of serving as part of a team advising senior members of the Greek government. The government was in big trouble economically and searching for ways to gain infusions of cash. One possibility officials were entertaining was selling a large plot of seaside land that had formerly served as an airport to the government of Qatar, which would develop it. Senior Greek officials, including the Prime Minister and other cabinet members, held an open meeting with Dust and other experts to publicly solicit their advice on whether the deal was a good idea. To most of these consultants, Dust included, selling the land seemed like a no-brainer, an easy way to help the country avoid a potential bankruptcy. The land in its present state didn't seem to be adding much value for the country. It was just a derelict former airport strewn with debris. The Qataris were poised to do something interesting and productive with it, benefiting Greece's economy. The Greek government appeared to agree with this assessment and seemed bent on proceeding with the property's sale. Rather than an open discussion about the deal, organizers of the meeting conceived of it as a scripted affair, in which consultants would tell Greek officials that they should sell the land so as to build public support for the plan. Dust entered the meeting prepared to endorse the deal and offer some thoughts on why it made sense. But as the conversation unfolded, he noticed something interesting. Although Greek officials spoke positively about the deal, some appeared ambivalent. In subtle and less subtle ways, the officials seemed to acknowledge how important it was that Athenians, as a traditionally ocean-going people, be connected physically with the sea. Since this land was one of the last oceanfront plots near Athens, and since earlier real estate projects elsewhere in the city had served to reduce the public's contact with the waterfront, the implication was that Athens would be losing something culturally and spiritually important if the land were sold. You could see and feel that this deal was actually quite disturbing to them, Dust said. The notion of dispensing with the last piece of oceanfront property that Athens had. When it came Dust's turn to speak, he made a spontaneous decision to scrap what he had prepared and instead articulate the unease about the plan he perceived people were feeling. He didn't tell the Greeks not to do the deal, but he did acknowledge their ambivalence and what they would be sacrificing if it went through. Doing so was risky. The cameras were rolling, and he didn't want to cause problems for his Greek hosts. As he remembers he felt uneasy and sick to his stomach as he spoke. But he went with his intuition anyway, telling officials what he felt they needed and wanted to hear. What happened next startled Dust. As the meeting adjourned, several burly security men surrounded him. Dust thought he had screwed up, and the government was escorting him out of the country. But then the Prime Minister came over to speak with him. He asked if we could have dinner, and said that I had articulated precisely what he and his fellow officials had been feeling. In the end, the Greek government decided not to sell the land to the Qataris. Greek officials would still need to solve the country's fiscal crisis. But at least they could feel satisfied that in this instance they had not betrayed the heritage of their capital city. By staying alert and listening closely to what the Greek politicians were really saying, Dust was able to respond authentically on the fly and have a profound, and quite positive, impact on his audience. We so often miss opportunities during spontaneous encounters to look for signs of what others around us are thinking, feeling, and needing. Often, we miss these opportunities due to noise, physical, physiological, and psychological. The environment might be noisy or distracting. We can barely hear ourselves think, much less attend to what others are thinking or feeling. Our bodies can distract us. We feel nervous, tired, or hungry, and have a harder time paying attention. Finally, mental factors can intrude. We judge what we hear or rehearse what we intend to say next. Our own biases or sense of status leads us to overlook others' perspectives and to focus instead on ourselves. The 3 Ps that impede us from listening well. 1. Physical noise. 2. Physiological noise, fatigue, hunger and anxiety. 3. Psychological noise, biases, judging and rehearsing. The power of listening. To truly connect with our audiences, we have established the importance of fighting distraction and orienting ourselves toward them. We must listen to what they're saying, and how they are saying it for clues on how we might most effectively connect. By observing our surroundings, we can pay attention not just to the words, but to nonverbal and situational signs that evoke their deeper emotions, desires, and needs. How are audience members reacting to what we're saying or doing? How is our current social environment influencing our interaction? What about our communication is resonating, and what isn't? What signals are they sending about how they feel in the moment? Striving to answer such questions allows us to steer our communications in ways that others find more relevant, thoughtful, and compelling. In turn, we wind up creating new opportunities for ourselves, whether it's a chance to build trust, forge a new relationship, connect more powerfully in the moment, appreciate others' perspectives better, or just operate more effectively. Learning to listen allows us to uncover previously unknown information or insights. It allows us to recognize patterns sooner and in different ways. Ori Fleischer, White House press secretary under President George W. Bush, called this listening via osmosis. He describes how he was able to do his job better when he was staying alert and absorbing information rather than merely giving it out. He learned early that he could never hope to serve as the expert in every room he was in, given the vast array of topics and policies he encountered throughout the day. Rather than beating himself up over situations in which he felt underprepared, Fleischer began to focus on soaking in the verbal and nonverbal information. Coming across new information about a policy area like social security or defense, he would make a mental note and store this information. He could make use of it later at opportune times, when asking a follow-up question, say, or when articulating an opinion. In effect, he would recognize a pattern, connecting something he'd seen earlier with something else that he was now seeing or hearing. Osmosis really worked, he says. It's amazing how much you absorb. It's a myriad of issues a press secretary gets exposed to, and you better absorb it all. That way, when it comes up in the briefing room, you can address it. My improv mentor Adam Tobin tells a story about a time he was pitching a new television show concept to a studio vice president. One of the first questions the vice president asked him was why his show wasn't a sci-fi story. It was an odd query that seemed to come out of nowhere. Tobin had never thought of the show he was pitching as science fiction. Yet he didn't brush off the question as silly or move on from it. Leveraging his skills as an expert listener and improviser, Tobin leaned in, inquiring why the assistant had asked the question. The vice president told Tobin that he had asked not so much because Tobin's show idea seemed like science fiction, but because his boss was nervous about producing anything that smacked of science fiction. His last 3 ventures in that genre had failed. What this person was doing, Tobin reflects, was actually asking me for ammunition that he could then take to his boss to sell my story. He was solving a problem that I didn't even know existed. By taking time to listen and be present, Tobin gleaned new information that would allow him to communicate more successfully in this current pitching situation, as well as in the future. He enhanced the degree of opportunity open to him through careful listening. Listening also opens up opportunities by helping us connect to those around us. One research study grouped participants in pairs, with one person listening and the other speaking. Some of the listeners received text messages while the speakers were talking, a deliberate attempt by the researchers to distract them. Those speakers whose listeners weren't visibly distracted were sharper, less anxious, and more eager to share their thoughts. The more we listen, the more headway we're liable to make with others. In subsequent studies with employees, researchers found that listening seems to make an employee more relaxed, more self-aware of his or her strengths and weaknesses, and more willing to reflect in a non-defensive manner. By allowing more information to flow and making collaboration easier, we can create more opportunity for connection and increase the chances that our spontaneous speaking will land successfully with our audience. Conversely, by failing to listen, we miss out on opportunities and sometimes even create new problems, communicating in ways that strike our audiences as jarring, tone-deaf, or off-putting. When I was in my early 20s, I interned for a famous film director and producer. On one occasion, I attended a meeting my boss was holding with several important Japanese film executives. I was familiar with Japanese cultural norms, so I knew that business professionals from Japan tend to present business cards in a more formal way than Americans typically do. When you first meet a business contact in Japan, you hold one of your cards in both hands, gaze down at it, and then hand it to the other person. The receiver of the card likewise takes great care, accepting the card in both hands, gazing at it, and then placing it on the table in front of them. My boss was oblivious to this ritual. When several of his guests handed him their cards, he did what most Americans would do: collect them into a stack, put them unceremoniously in his wallet, and then sit down to start the meeting. Mistakes like this happen all the time in business, but we usually can salvage the situation if we stay alert to people's responses. My boss didn't do that. He failed to pick up subtle and not-so-subtle signs that he'd committed a faux pas: a stiffening in the shoulders of his guests, a nervous smile, an awkward silence. Two guests sitting just feet away from him exchanged confused and disapproving glances. Even a novice like me could see that something inappropriate had just happened. The meeting continued for another hour, and the tension in the air never dissipated, but my boss didn't seem to notice. We've all failed to listen during spontaneous encounters and paid the price. Perhaps we've thrown our support behind an idea before taking the time to find out if the team thinks it's the optimal solution. Perhaps we've rushed to offer a solution to a problem articulated by our significant other, when in fact all they want is to vent and feel heard. Perhaps we've asked someone out on a date because they seem to like us, when in fact they were only trying to be friendly. We could avoid so many of the small, and not so small, miscues that arise in daily life if we simply paid more attention to what others are truly communicating to us. Becoming more attentive. How might we listen better in the midst of a spontaneous speaking situation? Drawing on his experiences playing college basketball, Stanford lecturer and consultant Collins Dobbs has created a useful 3-step framework for handling difficult encounters with others called PACE, Space, and Grace. We can use this framework to orient ourselves toward listening not just during challenging conversations, but in any interaction we have with others. In essence, the framework prompts us to slow down just a bit, reflect on what might be going on in the minds of others around us, and cue into our intuitive sense of what's happening. The end result is more empathic listening and better, more informed communication in the moment. Let's look, learn, and listen. Step number 1, slow your pace. Life comes at us fast, and as a result, so many of us end up thinking fast, speaking fast, and listening fast. By slowing down and focusing on simply being present and paying attention, we can become more receptive to messages from others we might otherwise miss. Former NPR journalist Deborah Schifrin has a technique she uses when interviewing others called the killer last question. As an interview is wrapping up, she'll ask her interviewee if there is anything important that she neglected to ask. Sometimes the person responds immediately, but if they don't, she does something radical. She waits, and waits some more. Most of the time, they respond that her questions covered everything. But Schifrin waits for a bit longer, letting the seconds tick by. And then, she relates, they will say the most interesting thing that they said in the whole interview. Schifrin theorizes that the dead time liberates interviewees because she, in effect, is giving them control over the conversation. This creates a condition where they're more likely to share something, or at the end of this conversation, we've been talking about a lot of things. It lets them ask a question of themselves and get to an answer that excites them. Schifrin's killer last question exemplifies the first strategy we can deploy to listen better in the moment. As Schifrin's example suggests, slowing our pace can also demonstrate interest and respect on our part. There are many actions we can take to slow our pace, not just at the end of the conversation, but at any time. We can put away our phones when sitting across the table from someone. We can take deep breaths. We can repeat mantras to ourselves, something like, "I'm here for you," or "This is important, so I should pay attention." We can remind ourselves of how important it is to listen. Try it. Practice pausing during your communication with others. To become more comfortable with this tactic, experiment with it first in conversations that are low stakes or conversational. Slowing down isn't only about making more time. It's also about what we do with that time. We must listen actively, quieting our minds and reducing judgment, so that we can better understand the gist of what others are saying, and so that others can perceive that we're paying attention. Academic experts have likened listening to a muscle that requires training, persistence, effort, and most importantly, the intention to become a good listener. To listen more intently, we can take steps like maintaining eye contact, conveying to others that we're listening via our facial expressions or head nodding, reflecting on what we're hearing, asking open-ended questions, and so on. We can also avoid holding conversations when we're distracted, rescheduling them for times when we know we can really focus. Honing our listening abilities, often means attending to the nuances of our own and others' nonverbal communication. Guy Ichikov, a well-known listening expert who teaches at the University of Haifa, told me how a couples counselor he knows stays alert to the dynamics that unfold thanks to subtle cues their clients give during sessions. Often, when one member of a couple, usually the male, becomes uncomfortable, he'll point his feet toward the door, as if he wants to leave. Although he might not express discomfort explicitly, his partner notices this cue either consciously or not, and it puts them on the defensive. They in turn will tighten up. They'll cross their arms, take a step back, or hunch their shoulders to make themselves small. We must stay alert for behavioral cues into how others are feeling, and we must also notice our own cues that might inhibit others from expressing themselves. As Ichikov further notes, we often take shortcuts when confronted by nonverbal communication. We assume we know what a particular gesture means, when in fact these might be highly individualized. Give the other person more time to speak, Ichikov advises. Don't be afraid of silence. People need time to think deeply. When we take time to listen, we can begin to parse the nuances of each person's nonverbal communication. We might find that a speaker's true emotions are somewhat different than what we initially inferred. Our mindset when listening matters too. If you're like me, you sometimes react in spontaneous situations by trying to solve a problem that crops up in the course of conversation. You think you're listening, but your problem-solving mindset leads you not to stay silent, but instead to interject with a solution. By contrast, a person with a listening attitude believes that the solution to the speaker's problem lies within the speaker, Ichikov says. Instead of rushing to offer a solution, someone with a listening mindset might instead try to help the speaker bring out a solution themselves by posing questions, listening closely to their responses, and asking follow-up questions. Questions might include, have you encountered a problem like this before? And what resources have you used to help you deal with something like this in the past? When we consciously adopt a listening mindset, people perceive us as better listeners. Much of the time, we probably are. Slowing our pace to practice active listening can help us to function better in a whole range of spontaneous situations. If we're at a business dinner, we can understand the real reason our manager just asked us to introduce the visiting colleague. If we're in the hallway chatting with our coworker, we can uncover her true motivation when she asks us for feedback. If we're at a party flirting with an attractive somebody, we can learn what this person really likes on a date, or the kind of relationship they really want. In all of these spontaneous situations, slowing down can help to build relationships and foster ongoing communication by conveying that we take keen interest in what the other person is saying. We also gain critical reconnaissance that helps us respond in the moment. Try it. Watch a video where someone is communicating and turn the sound down. Notice the person's nonverbal behavior. What are their eyes doing? Are they expansive in their gestures, or is their body tightened? How is their body oriented? All of these cues and clues serve either to reinforce or betray what they're trying to convey. Step number 2, make space for reflection. When veteran Silicon Valley designer Bob Baxley presents his work to other executives, he doesn't spend all of his time talking. He makes a point to listen a lot. I never try to respond to feedback in the moment and redesign the thing in real time, he says. I coach my team to do the same thing. This is our moment to just listen and take notes. We'll synthesize later what we hear and try to make sense of it. 12. Fred Dust takes a similar approach. When something he hears triggers a response in him that might take him off in a new direction, he restrains himself so that he has time to think. You shouldn't feel like you should be forced into having to respond, he says. In addition to moderating our pace, we can listen better in the moment by carving out space for ourselves to reflect on what we've heard. We've taken the time to open ourselves up to others' perspectives. Now we must ponder our own responses and how we might best meet the other person's needs. One step we can take to buy ourselves time and gain the space we need to make sense of signals we're receiving from others is to ask clarifying questions. What makes you believe this? How does this help? What more can you tell me? As Schifrin observes, the act of posing a question requires a certain amount of bravery on our part. We're relinquishing control to the other person by inviting them to respond, and we might feel nervous about where the conversation might lead. Yet, doing so can allow us to process what we hear, while again sending cues that we are paying attention, helping us to gain further details and insights. Try it. Over the next day, make a point of asking several clarifying questions. in the course of 3 conversations in which you're a part. Make it your mission to get the other person to explain to you the problem they are trying to solve, the feelings they hope to share, or the information they need. Notice how you get more detail and how you feel less pressure to respond right away. I know how difficult, but also how helpful it can be to pose clarifying questions. Not long ago, while I was teaching communication skills to a group of 75 startup founders and executives, one of them approached me during a break to offer unsolicited feedback about my presentation. This gentleman disliked my material and how I was presenting it. He accused me of being wrong and teaching people to be boring. My first inclination was to react defensively or politely brush this person off. Instead, I tried to create some space to understand what exactly he was saying. I asked him to help me understand why this is teaching people to be boring. As painful as it was to hear this audience member out, I did it. Processing what he was saying, I realized that he wasn't having a bad day or trying to be a jerk. He was well-intentioned and genuinely wanted to see me succeed. This new awareness on my part shifted the meaning of his remarks. I was now willing to take them more seriously. His biggest concern had to do with the sequencing of my material. While I was trying to scaffold knowledge in a logical and methodical manner, he felt my build-up was too slow and disengaging. His feedback helped me, and I never would have heard it had I not allowed myself space to reflect on his initial feedback. Further, the time I gained while he was answering my questions allowed me to respond more appropriately. When I deliver the content he deemed boring, I now set it up by posing a question that gets my audiences engaged up front and interested in seeing where I am going to take them. Beyond asking clarifying questions, a second way we might create an opening for reflection is to paraphrase what we've just heard a speaker say. Paraphrasing isn't parroting back what the other person said. For example, what I hear you saying is. Rather, it's distilling the essence of what we heard them communicate. Doing so can serve a number of purposes. Depending on the context, it can ensure that we understood someone's meaning correctly. It can allow us to acknowledge an emotion that someone is feeling. It can give us a chance to make connections between ideas. It can show others that we've been listening. And in most situations, it can also allow us to step back and think about what we've been hearing. Adam Tobin notes that paraphrasing serves in effect to extend the present moment for just a little bit longer. By articulating your sense of what someone just said, you're kind of living in that space for a little moment. It's like, okay, before we rush on to what we think about that, or what that means, let's take a moment and just be in that for a sec. Giving ourselves some space allows us to get our bearing, rather than allowing a conversation to rush past us. Several years back, I was invited to facilitate a strategic planning initiative at a community college where I taught. Time was of the essence, and the conversation sometimes got heated. I often found myself paraphrasing monologues or longer group discussions with short statements like, cost sounds important, or the implementation time must be considered. My paraphrasing not only focused the topics being discussed, it allowed for some space and time for myself and the participants to reflect and consider our next actions. Both questions and paraphrasing focus on what others around us have said. A final way to make space focuses on what went unsaid. We can remark on what we just heard and clarify the speaker's meaning by asking about something they omitted. This tactic works well when someone offers you a suggestion or spontaneous critical feedback. In pointing out an opportunity for you or a mistake you made, they might describe the consequences for their team. You could say, I'm hearing that cost and timing must be considered jointly. I hadn't considered the interaction of those two factors. How does this impact your team and you? Asking for elaboration in this way can help. You unearth and reflect on powerful feelings the speaker is experiencing that might be lingering beneath the surface. As you come to understand these feelings, you might well have a clearer idea of how to respond in a way that is productive and helpful. Here is another way to use this, what I didn't hear of question, to keep a conversation moving. Students I teach or people I coach often experience high levels of speaking anxiety. They will share their challenges, fears, and issues. I try to validate what I hear, but my first observation in most cases is, while I understand fully how speaking is often nerve-wracking for you, can you talk about the times you successfully spoke and weren't as nervous? Not only does this question help the folks I work with to realize that they are not always nervous, it gives me space to reflect on what they have said so that I can better respond in the moment. Some key ways to give yourself space: ask clarifying questions. Paraphrase what you hear. Comment on what hasn't been said. Step number 3, grace. Some years ago, my friend John's beloved French grandmother passed away. His grandmère, as he called her, had played a pivotal role in her life, and he wanted to do something special to honor her and express his grief. When his mother told him that a relatively new parish priest, who barely knew grandmère, would deliver the eulogy at her funeral, John asked if he might do it instead. He felt his grandmère deserved to have someone who loved her speak about her life, not a stranger. For 2 days leading up to the funeral, John wrote and rewrote his eulogy, trying to craft his remarks and get them just right. The right anecdotes, the right tone, the right structure, the right length, the right language. When he felt satisfied that he was communicating exactly what he felt in his heart and what his audience might appreciate, he jotted the final speech down on note cards word for word. He had given a few speeches as a high school student, reading them in front of crowds of fellow students. He felt fairly confident that his skills as a communicator would see him through. Still, he felt anxious, wondering whether he'd be able to perform well amid his grief and in the formal environment of a church chapel, with the priest and others in the community looking on. At his grandmère's funeral, John felt butterflies in his stomach as the priest called his name, inviting him to deliver the eulogy. More than 100 people sat in the pews, including many John didn't know. As he walked up to the pulpit, he did the best he could to keep himself from breaking down. When he reached the lectern, however, another, bigger problem presented itself. He felt in his suit pocket for the cards, and they weren't there. He felt around again, his heart pounding, the breath catching in his throat. Nothing. 100 faces stared up at him, waiting for him to begin. For a moment there, John recalls, I felt like running off the altar. But he didn't. Gazing out at his extended family, and seeing their expressions of grief and sadness, he remembered why he had come, to commemorate and celebrate his grandmère's life, and decided to improvise. After all, he thought, everything I had written on my note cards was already inscribed in my heart. Maybe he could still convey the essence of what he'd wanted to say. John proceeded as best he could, interspersing memories he recalled from his prepared eulogy with new ones that came to him in the moment, adding some quick reflections he thought of as he gauged the audience's reaction. At one point, when audience members seemed to shift in their seats, he realized he was veering off too far on a tangent and gave himself a moment to pick a new direction. At another, as he saw tears on the face of a family member, his own throat caught with emotion. Given the circumstances, he reminded himself that this was completely understandable. Each time, he managed to recover and get back on track, and it was okay. I am sure my words were not perfect, but the feelings I expressed were 100% authentic. Instead of looking at my scribbles as I spoke, I got to see the faces of other loved ones, marked with tears and smiles. Thrust unexpectedly into a spontaneous communication situation, John made the most of it by listening. He registered the emotions of others in attendance and remained sensitive to his internal voice, which told him not to run, but instead to put his trust in himself and to wing it. He continued to pay attention to his internal voice as he delivered his remarks, processing the reactions of those around him and letting his internal voice guide his behavior in response. As soon as John stepped down from the altar, he knew that his eulogy was well received. Some of his relatives shot him grateful looks. His mother and sisters reached over and hugged him or grasped his hand as he sat down. Because his words were spontaneous and not rigidly planned, and because he had attended to others' emotions as well as to his own internal voice in delivering his remarks, his eulogy came across as more authentic and meaningful, even if it wasn't perfect, in fact, because it wasn't. In the context of spontaneous encounters, listening presents us with a paradox. Doing it well doesn't just involve paying close attention to others. It also means cueing in to the small voices inside our own heads, the inner dialogue that ticks on as we're communicating with others. Interpersonal relationships experts David Bradford and Carol Robin note that to connect well with others we must pick up 2 signals from 2 different antennas, one internal and the other external. They suggest that whenever we are in conversation with someone, there are 2 dialogues going on, the one we are having with the other persons, and the one we are having with ourselves. We need to respect both of these. So often we presume we must focus exclusively on others when we listen to them, and that if we don't, we're somehow bad listeners. We're supposed to cancel out or dampen our own feelings and judgments as they arise, pretending that they don't exist. We do better in spontaneous situations if we show ourselves a little grace and give ourselves permission to have our inner voice heard as well. Of course, we shouldn't let our feelings and judgments overwhelm what we hear from others, but we shouldn't ignore or discount them entirely, either. Drawing on our past experience, we should validate our feelings, even in cases when we're not particularly proud of them. To the extent we can, we should scrutinize our feelings, noticing patterns and pondering why we're feeling and thinking as we are. When our internal voice strikes us as particularly compelling, we should pay attention and potentially take action. Quite often in conversations, we'll hear ourselves say, "That doesn't feel right," or "There's something more going on here." In response, we can decide to follow up with actions such as asking more questions, rethinking our initial responses, or ending the conversation. Showing grace for ourselves means allowing room for introspection, and then on a minute-by-minute basis, allowing our introspection to shape our behavior. Look consciously for opportunities to convey emotions that you might be feeling in the course of interacting with others. Challenge yourself during your next 3 substantive conversations to interject at least once or twice, expressing emotions you're feeling. You might say something like, "No, what you're saying brings an interesting feeling up for me," and then elaborate as best you can. Externalizing your emotions can get you in the habit of registering your internal voice more strongly and listening to it. In so doing, you're training yourself to feel and share more, listening for what needs to be done, and doing it. At a TED conference in 2008, a panel discussion being filmed by the BBC was underway when the proceedings halted due to a technical problem. Awkwardness ensued as the host, a BBC on-air personality, struggled to fill in the dead time. Then someone in the audience spoke up, seemingly out of nowhere, an apparent heckler. According to one eyewitness, he began speaking loudly as if he were conducting a live news feed, joking that he was reporting live from TED but couldn't understand a expletive word and was wondering why at a technology conference everything is running so shittily. It was none other than the comic legend Robin Williams, eager and willing to salvage the event, probably to the great interest and relief of its organizers. Williams sauntered on stage for some impromptu banter, tossing out rapid-fire jokes on diverse subjects, including the physicist Stephen Hawking, Google, the country of Israel, and the British royal family. Williams's off-the-cuff musings were so funny that the event's organizer came on stage and asked if he'd come back the following day to say a few words. Encountering an unexpected situation, Williams stepped into the fray, doing what needed to be done to keep the audience happy and fill the time while the technicians figured out how to solve the problem. How did he pull it off? Clearly, he was a comedic genius who was unafraid to reveal his personality in a public setting. But he also deployed skills available to any of us. When the glitch occurred, he was present and paying attention. Not only did he realize that an opportunity existed to step up, he tuned into the emotions and perceptions of his fellow audience members and delivered jokes that in some way captured or played off them. He was clearly cueing in to the needs and desires of others around him. We are all capable of doing the same. We can communicate fairly well in impromptu situations if we take the lessons of previous chapters to heart, learning to control our anxiety, restraining our drive toward perfectionism, and seeing spontaneous moments as opportunities rather than threats. But we can't truly connect with others unless we pay attention to them as well as to ourselves, creating an ongoing dialogue in our minds between what we're picking up from others and what our own internal voices are saying we should do in response. We can't create, experience, and project that kind of pitch-perfect communication Williams spawned that day unless we're listening, in the fullest sense of the word. That means adding more pace, space, and grace to our spontaneous communication. Drill it. 1. Now that you've experimented with asking clarifying questions to create space for listening, prepare some of these questions in advance. Examples might be, can you provide more specific detail? Can you share with me some of your experiences with this? How does this apply to what you're currently working on? How can this help you and others? Having questions ready can alleviate pressure you might feel in the moment. 2. To practice paraphrasing, listen to other people speaking live in person or perhaps on a podcast or other interviews and think to yourself, the bottom line here is, do this over and over to habituate yourself to distilling key points. If possible, you might also wish on occasion to confirm with the speaker whether your paraphrase of their communication was accurate. 3. Take a few minutes to ask a trusted other about your recent listening. How strong a listener do they think you are? Do you tend to listen better or worse at certain times or in certain contexts? Do certain subjects cause your attention to drift or prompt you to interject a comment too quickly? Do disconnects between what they think they're saying and what you hear frequently arise? If listening is in fact a problem in your relationship, see if this other person would be willing to check in with you periodically to give additional feedback.